Hello everyone, Ace here, and today someone, it turns out, decided to try to debunk one of my recent videos on Destiny, specifically the video in which I reported Destiny to the FBI for being a domestic terrorist, after he argued that Republicans need to be in fear for their lives in order to get the Republicans to do what Destiny wants. So yeah, this person, an individual known as the Deranged Philosopher, aka Bob Miller 5009, decided to take up the argument that what Destiny was doing does not constitute real domestic terrorism. For you see, real domestic terrorism has never been tried. Or to put it into more technical terms, the Deranged Philosopher seriously tried to take up the position that the phrase be made to fear for their lives is not quite the same as the phrase needs to be in fear for their lives, and therefore it is completely different, and not making the exact same argument, even though in this context it is. Anyone who isn't a habitual liar would very readily recognize that it is in fact the same in this context. But of course, Deranged Philosopher is a habitual liar.
So that's just an unsubstantiated claim. Where's the evidence I said something that was untrue? Where's the evidence that I knew it was untrue? Where's the evidence that while I said an untruth, my intention was to deceive my audience? Where's the evidence that I do that sort of thing habitually? There's none provided. This just seems like poisoning the well fallacy.
Which is why he went out of his way to try to argue that what happened to Charlie Kirk, getting brutally murdered in front of his family by a leftist for daring to espouse an opinion in the vicinity of leftists, well, that's just comparable to being a reckless driver.
No, that's not what I was saying. I was not saying that Charlie Kirk getting killed is the same as or is comparable to being a reckless driver. What I was doing was making an argument from analogy. Here's the analogy. If someone were to say, reckless drivers need to be in fear for their lives, and it's a problem that they're not in fear for their lives, in that case, that would not be incitement to violence, and I think we can all agree on that. Now here's the problem. Here's the argument from analogy. Destiny's statement has the same form as the statement about reckless drivers. Destiny said, Republicans need to be in fear for their lives, and it's not good that they're not. I'm using the car analogy to demonstrate that this statement here, X needs to be in fear for their life, it's not good that X is not in fear for their lives. That statement alone does not meet the legal qualifications for inciting violence. It doesn't matter what content, it doesn't matter what variable you put in place of X. These two X's here, independent of what those variables are, this statement, absent additional context, is not incitement to violence. And I was hoping to convey that point by showing you that if we replace the two X's here with reckless drivers, you would agree with me. It's not incitement to violence. But here's the problem. You can't have a double standard. If it's not incitement to violence in the case of the reckless drivers, then absent a relevant category distinction, it's not incitement to violence in the case of replacing those two X's with Republicans. I'm sorry, but that's just not how it works. You're being inconsistent.
Because just like how a reckless driver needs to be in fear of being in a car crash, Charlie Kirk apparently needed to be in fear of getting brutally murdered by a leftist. That wasn't Destiny being prescriptive, you see. That was Destiny being descriptive. So said the Deranged Philosopher.
You need drivers to fear reckless driving so that they don't do it. I guess that's a threat now if you're a fucking retard. And notice how Destiny didn't say we should make anything anyway. He didn't use the word make, and nonetheless this moron is gonna plug that word in and then derive his conclusion and run to the FBI. What an idiot. People that do drugs need to be aware of the potential danger that their drug is laced with fentanyl. Now, is that a threat against drug users? Am I inciting violence against drug users? No.
So yes, now that we see that the Deranged Philosopher is indeed living up to his name by comparing what happened to Charlie Kirk to being a reckless driver.
No, I'm sorry, but as deranged as I may be, you are incapable of understanding an argument. It's so painful. I'm not comparing Charlie Kirk fearing being shot and reckless drivers fearing reckless driving. What I am comparing, and it should have been made clear to you in my video, is Destiny's statement. I'm comparing what he said to another statement that is equal in its form, but different in its content, and then I argue that if one is not incitement to violence, then neither is the other, as they have the same form. To put this in logical terms that I'm sure you're unaware of, you wouldn't be able to construct a valid deductive argument where the conclusion is that one incited violence if you're using as justification for that conclusion, i.e. in one of the premises, it contains a statement equivalent to that of Destiny's, at least in its formal structure. Then, granted that that is the means by which you attempt to deduce an incitement to violence, your argument is always going to come up invalid, independent of the content that the form of Destiny's statement takes. So how about actually try to contend with that argument instead of strawmanning me and claiming that I was making a comparison between Charlie Kirk fearing being shot and reckless drivers fearing the consequences of their driving. Try not to strawman me, try to understand my argument. I know it's hard for you, I know it's over your head, I know it's not what you're used to. But if you actually engage with what I'm saying, even if you do a terrible job at refuting it, I'll cut you some slack. But I will not cut you slack if you just strawman me and are too intellectually lazy to understand my argument.
Which is to say, again, just like how a reckless driver should be in fear of being in a car crash, Charlie Kirk should have been in fear of being brutally murdered by a leftist for daring to speak his mind in public in the vicinity of leftists. Let's talk about some of the things that the deranged philosopher is, I'm sure unintentionally, but nevertheless certainly arguing that the claim that Republicans, such as for example Charlie Kirk, should be in fear for their lives for going out in public in the vicinity of leftists is somehow descriptive rather than prescriptive. Which is to say that he claims that Destiny was arguing that what happened to Charlie Kirk was an act of nature. It was how things naturally are. You know, being brutally murdered by a leftist for daring to espouse an opinion in public in the vicinity of leftists. Which if you think about it is a very damning thing to say about leftists in general. It's the argument that leftists are such fundamentally deranged lunatics that you should expect to be murdered by one of them should you dare espouse an opinion in the vicinity of them. The argument being presented from the deranged philosopher is, like I said unintentionally, that far leftists are incapable of agency.
That is a stunning degree of confusion. The level of confusion here is astounding. So first off, I challenge you, or any one of your fans, to demonstrate that anything I said, explicitly or implicitly, entails that leftists don't have agency. Nothing I said entails that. Go. I'd like to see you try produce, from statements I made, an argument that is valid and sound, the conclusion of which is that, given my statement, I am necessarily committed to leftists not having agency. Guess what? I'm calling your bluff. You can't do that. You can't even get close. I'd love to see you try.
That they can't help being violent lunatics the moment they notice a take that is slightly right of Mao. The deranged philosopher is in fact arguing that far leftists should not be seen as human beings. In fact, even dogs have agency, so the deranged philosopher is arguing that leftists are not just subhuman, but sub-animal as well. Now I get that the deranged philosopher, aka Bob Miller 5009, is a leftist, and therefore lacks the mental capacity necessary to realize the inevitable conclusions of his argument. But that doesn't stop them from being the inevitable conclusions of his argument. To argue that what Destiny said was descriptive instead of prescriptive, the deranged philosopher has to argue that it is simply beyond the capability of leftists in general to not be deranged violent lunatics who are utterly unfit for even existing within society.
This is the fattest, juiciest, most voluptuous non sequitur I have ever seen. Let's examine what my statement is, and let's see how this guy thinks my statement somehow entails that leftists are inevitably violent lunatics without agency. The statement he's referring to is the one I made about Destiny's statement. What was Destiny's statement? Well, Destiny said that Republicans need to be in fear of their lives. I said of that statement that it is descriptive. Now, what does that mean? It very simply means that Destiny's statement that Republicans need to be in fear for their lives in order for them to look to their leaders to turn down the temperature, it merely means to call that statement descriptive just means that I'm saying that Destiny's statement is not aiming to a call for particular violent action. It's not aiming at prescribing as a resolution to his description a set of outcomes that are violent that need to be enacted. Rather, what Destiny's doing is that he's providing a descriptive factual account of a situation, and within that situation he claims that thing X is necessary in order for thing B to occur. And what makes this purely descriptive is that he's enunciating a set of facts, he's describing the way reality is, but he makes no explicit commitment to how reality ought to be. He's not telling us that the description he provided, the accounting he gave of how reality is, he's not telling us that that needs to be changed with a set of explicit violent actions. This all means that legally there's no incitement to violence. Now, as obvious as the following may seem to any and all intelligent listeners, clearly the guy that runs this channel and all of his followers do not understand the difference between description and prescription, so I'm going to give an analogy just so they can swallow this very difficult concept. If a doctor tells his patient that he has cancer, and that the only way to rid the cancer was chemotherapy, that would be descriptive, as it's not an explicit call to a particular action. However, if the doctor had said, you have cancer, and because of that we are going to impose chemotherapy, we are going to do chemotherapy, that's prescriptive. So let's examine Destiny's statement. Destiny says Republicans need to fear for their lives so that they go to their leaders to turn down the temperature. The form of that statement is S needs to feel P so that they do X. This is descriptive, as it is an accounting of facts, not a call to enforce action. Therefore, 1. Destiny is not inciting violence, as you can't get a normative conclusion from descriptive premises. And 2, the proposition that S needs to feel P so that they do X, calling that proposition descriptive does not entail, quote, that leftists have no free will and must be deranged violent lunatics, right? Call that proposition about leftists being absent free will and full of violent lunatics, call that proposition P1. It is logically impossible to derive P1 from any statement calling another statement of the form S needs to feel P so that they do X descriptive. The reason it's logically impossible to derive P1 from such a statement is because this statement is a causal descriptive claim with no bearing on evaluative, global, or metaphysical claims. Let's examine it again. S needs to feel P so that they do X. That's a causal descriptive claim. To say that from that you derive a global normative claim, right, purely from a local descriptive premise, that's a category error. So not only are you unable to demonstrate that what I've said entails P1, but now I've shown that it's logically impossible for my statement that S needs to feel P so that they do X is descriptive. That statement, it is logically impossible for that to entail P1.
Because they'll murder you for espousing a slightly different opinion, like they murdered Charlie Kirk, and how it's apparently Charlie Kirk's fault for not being afraid of being murdered by a leftist for daring to espouse an opinion in the vicinity of leftists. Now, there is something to be said about the argument that yes, far leftists are legitimately that violent, and they are legitimately that evil. I'd go so far as to say that every single leftist at this point is essentially channeling Germany's economic migrant chancellor from the 1940s.
Where's the evidence for that? You just made a claim about tens of millions of people, because there are tens of millions of leftists in America. You're saying that each and every one of them are channeling Adolf Hitler. Where's the evidence? Did you conduct a survey? Do you have a sound argument for this conclusion? Or are you just talking out of your ass, making shit up like you did about Destiny inciting violence when he didn't? Like you did about me being a habitual liar? Like you did when you had said that I had made the comparison that Charlie Kirk worrying about being killed is the same as drivers being worried about their reckless driving?
The man who started the Holocaust with affirmative action programs because he claimed Jewish people were systemically oppressing Germans. The same man who was a self-described social justice warrior, according to one of his own speeches in 1920. The same individual who in 1919 was an open communist and an elected official of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. Seriously, at this point, the biggest difference between Adolf Hitler and a modern leftist is that a modern leftist would never be satisfied with murdering a mere 6 million people.
A modern leftist would not be satisfied with killing a mere 6 million people. Where the fuck did you get that information? Did you survey leftists and this is what they self-reported? Did you infer this from their actions? Did leftists kill 6 million people and are seemingly not satisfied? Where the fuck did this happen? Does leftist ideology entail a commitment to this position? Or again, are you just asserting highly dubious and unlikely claims without any shred of evidence?
And I really look forward to seeing the deranged philosopher trying to take these quotes about how Jewish people have Jewish privilege in Germany and try to argue that they aren't the words of a far leftist.
Why would I do that? Do you really think that I'm committed to defending anyone who reports to be on the left? Sure, Hitler said that he was a National Socialist. That's what he called his movement. Sure, he said some awful, horrible, horrendous stuff that I condemn without hesitation. Sure, there are many horrible leftists that I condemn. However, I'm not going to sit here quietly while you lie and say that Destiny is inciting violence. No matter how bad of a person Destiny is, him being bad, him saying horrible things, does not thereby make those things an incitement to violence. Had you argued that what Destiny said was despicable and gross and disgusting, I may be inclined to agree with you. But it's not incitement to violence. Not every horrible, horrendous, disgusting thing is incitement to violence worth reporting to the FBI, which is what you did and it's what you said. And it's the only claim here that I have an interest in refuting. Destiny is not inciting violence. There's a high legal standard for that threshold. He hasn't crossed it. Legally, it's not sufficient to have an ambiguous quote that perhaps alludes to violence under some interpretations, where the quote isn't specific, where the quote makes no mention of a particular person, place, or time, or action that needs to be enacted that is violent. All of those things need to be present. None of them are.
But the simple fact of the matter is that just because far leftists are that extreme and that violent and that evil, that doesn't prevent what Destiny said from being prescriptive rather than descriptive. See, the phrase Republicans need to be in fear for their lives is built upon the presumption that they aren't already in fear for their lives.
That's a complete non sequitur. You can very easily state a necessary condition for some outcome without implying that the necessary condition isn't already met. Watch, I'll do it. Here's a counterexample. I need to live in order to go to the grocery store. Does that imply that I'm not alive? Does that imply that I've never went to the grocery store? No, it doesn't entail or imply either of those things. You have no idea how logic works. You seem to have no grasp as to how to make a valid inference given the truth or falsehood of a given proposition. This is embarrassing.
Which, for the record, is something that Destiny himself explicitly stated right after the fear for their lives quote. Specifically when Destiny said, quote, "The issue is, right now, they don't feel like there is any fear," unquote.
You need conservatives to be afraid of getting killed when they go to events so that they look to their leadership to turn down the temperature.
Remember what I said earlier about Destiny's claim and the form that his claim takes? Recall the form. S needs to feel P in order so that they do X. That is a descriptive claim about a causal relation.
They don't feel like there's any fear. Like, I don't know, it's like memes. It's just memes to everybody, I guess. I don't know, bro. I don't care. I'm playing video games. Okay, I'm done today. I don't give a fuck. The issue is right now, they don't feel like there's any fear. The issue is right now, they don't feel like there's any fear. The issue is right now, they don't feel like there's any fear.
In other words, Destiny is not describing how things currently are. He is prescribing how things should be. He believes Republicans should be in fear for their lives.
First of all, Destiny did not explicitly state, I want Republicans to be in fear for their lives. But I'll grant that he implied that because it's just totally irrelevant as to what Destiny wants. Legally speaking, incitement to violence has nothing to do with what you want. There's no law about what you're allowed and not allowed to like and want. The law has everything to do with what you say. Did Destiny say that people should go out and commit specific acts of violence? No, he didn't. Discussion over, no incitement. Shut the fuck up.
But currently aren't. And it's this should be part that makes it prescriptive. So Destiny is in fact being prescriptive when he says that Republicans need to be in fear for their lives.
No, that's just not true. In order for it to be prescriptive, it's not enough that one want reality to change and be a certain way. Rather, one has to prescribe a diagnosis by which they can make reality that way. If I say, for example, I want you dead, that's a description of my internal desires. If I say I'm going to make you dead, that's a prescription because I'm describing how I'm going to enforce or impose something. Look up the fucking definition. Saying I want you dead, not a threat. Saying I'm going to make you dead, that's a threat. But it's something Destiny didn't say, so that doesn't work for you.
Which of course brings about the question how exactly that's going to be accomplished. And thanks to one of the commentators on the Deranged Philosopher's own video, it is very well demonstrated that the Deranged Philosopher is just being dishonest in this whole situation. As High Plains Drifter 3000 asks, quote, so what needs to happen to make them fear? He said they don't fear now, but he needs them to. Deranged Philosopher, aka Bob Miller 5009, replies with, quote, reckless drivers need to fear a crash for them to drive better. Is that incitement against reckless drivers? No, it's not. High Plains Drifter replies with, quote, so what's not happening that needs to happen to make them fear? Deranged Philosopher replies with, quote, for them to realize there are consequences for constant demonization of opponents. High Plains Drifter replies with, quote, so right now they don't realize it apparently. So what needs to happen to make them? Deranged Philosopher replies with, quote, education. High Plains Drifter replies with, quote, so make them fear with words. But they aren't leftist, they are rightist. Apparently only sticks and stones will hurt them, never words. And there it is at the end of the tunnel. This is where the constant lies utilized by people like the Deranged Philosopher completely fall upon themselves.
Oh yeah, you really got me there where you squeezed it out of me that I want to educate people and not be violent. I can't believe you caught me in my web of lies of wanting people to be better educated. You just claim I lied. There's absolutely no evidence I've lied here. What have I said that's not true? That's the first step. How do you know that I knew it was untrue? And how do you know that I was intending to deceive when I said it? None of that's clear. None of that's established. There's no evidence for any of that. What the fuck? And mind you, this is a completely defensible, legitimate position that I enunciated.
Because at the end of the day, in order to make that happen, to make people be in fear for their lives, the capacity of violence is required in order to make that happen.
That's absolutely false, and I could easily provide a bevy of counterexamples where you can make someone fear for their lives without having to threaten them with violence. You could just show them that their actions are likely to lead to violent consequences without you threatening violent consequences. Those aren't the same. For example, in this context, if I say demonizing your political opponents can lead to a political civil war or endless political tit-for-tat violence that has happened in the past, given that it's happened in the past, it's likely to happen in the future if we follow those same patterns. Don't repeat those patterns. Thank you very much. Is that a fucking threat? Am I saying I'm going to do anything? Am I advocating for people to do things for you? Again, no, it's a description. It's a causal description. In the past, these causes tend to give rise to these effects. You're implementing those very causes. It's probably going to lead to those effects. Not that I'm going to do them. Not that I'm advocating for them. Yeah, you should fear the consequences of your behavior, if your behavior is likely to lead to devastating consequences. We shouldn't impose a fascist or communist government because in the past that's led to the death of tens of millions. That's an instance where I can, via education, induce fear while simultaneously not be threatening violence against people.
No one ever had their throat slit with an adjective. If you're going to argue that millions of people need to be in fear for their lives, well, that does ultimately require more than just educating them, as the Deranged Philosopher puts it. In fact, he himself had to admit that they had to face potential consequences.
Yeah, not all consequences are violent, first of all. For example, you could have a consequence like the erosion of society, and also the consequences that are violent, not all violent consequences that can happen because of your actions are threats if I point them out. If there's a mob of violent, psychopathic, lunatic protesters and you're about to go run into that mob and incite confrontation, if I tell you, hey, don't do that, you should be in fear for your life, going in there and inciting conflict, you should be in fear so you don't get the shit kicked out of you and potentially killed. That's not a threat, right? It's descriptive. I'm describing what is likely to occur if you carry on with your sort of behavior.
Those potential consequences being murdered violently by a deranged lunatic leftist. So if that's what Destiny wants to happen...
First of all, Destiny never claimed or implied he wants the means of installation of fear to be violence. And even if, in his head, he actually wanted the installation of fear to come through violence, that's not incitement unless he advocates clearly for violence, which he didn't do.
or claims needs to happen, the deranged philosopher is ultimately admitting that yes, Destiny is a domestic terrorist. Because what Destiny prescribed, emphasis on prescribed, because he openly stated that this is not how things are right now, but instead what needs to happen, aka what things should be like.
Destiny never made an explicit statement about the way things should be, but even if he did, that is not incitement. Let's not pretend like we don't know the difference between talking about the way something should be idealistically and giving a direct command to make it that way, especially when that direct command is a violent one, none of which happened. Absolutely none of which happened, which is necessary in order for somebody to actually be convicted with incitement of violence, and that is what this goon is claiming. He's claiming this is legal incitement of violence. Additionally, I entirely disagree with his claim that Destiny was prescribing anything. In order for Destiny to actually have been prescribing something, he has to be making an explicit call to action, not just mere description, and not just mere citing of a causal condition necessary, i.e. needed to produce some outcome, which is what I think he did. But I could grant for the sake of argument that Destiny actually was prescribing something. And even if he was prescribing something, even if he wasn't making a call to action, the thing he was advocating for via action most plausibly was not at all violence. If there's one thing you have a claim to make about Destiny actively prescribing some action, that would be that Destiny said that people need to fear being shot. However, even if Destiny had indisputably said that people need to fear being shot, not to produce some outcome, but rather we actually need to go and make it the case, make it, a word he didn't use, make it the case that people fear being shot, that's not the same as claiming people need to be shot. It simply doesn't follow that if someone wants people to fear being shot, that therefore they want people shot. Those are two distinct, entirely different things. One is a feeling, one is an action. Let's not pretend to be unable to grasp this distinction, right? We can all easily understand that, imagine, say, some husband told you about his wife in confidence, oh, by the way, I get a huge kick out of, and I get a big power trip from, making my wife fear that I'm going to leave her. You wouldn't thereby conclude, oh my god, absent additional claims about wanting to leave his wife, he wants to leave his wife. He's clearly stating intentionality to leave his wife, because if he wants his wife to fear that he's going to leave, it follows he's going to leave. No, it doesn't. One's a feeling, one's an action. One could easily well want the feeling without actually wanting at all the action. You dumb fuck. You never heard of the concept of someone wanting other people to think that they're crazy, reckless, brave, courageous, violent, powerful, you name it, without actually wanting to commit any of the associated actions. But all of a sudden, you think Destiny says, and he doesn't, but you think Destiny says or implies that he wants us to go and make MAGA fear for their lives, and this distinction between wanting them to fear for their lives and us taking their lives, you can't grasp that? That's just inconceivable. He must be advocating for violence. You're gonna run to the FBI. Either you're playing dumb because of political motivations, or you are fucking dumb. If you argue he implied the need to shoot people because he said he wants them to fear being shot, and the only way he could instantiate that fear is by actually shooting people, there's a straightforward objection to that claim, and that is, there are many perfectly legal, non-violent, inciting ways of instilling fear, like through educating people, that if they endlessly demonize their political opponents, that can lead to all sorts of problems, hostilities, and violence. Not that you're advocating for it. This can instill fear of violence without encouraging, promoting, or otherwise calling for it, you dumb shit. So again, it simply doesn't follow that if someone wants people to fear being shot, that therefore he wants them shot. And it definitely doesn't follow that if someone wants others to fear being shot, that he is thereby inciting violence, as what's missing is a clear call to violent action. Wanting others to be in fear is not an action, let alone a violent one. The statement, I want people to be in fear of X happening, but I don't actually want X to happen, or I'm not advocating for X, is totally consistent, thus showing that wanting fear of X does not entail wanting X to happen.
Requires, as the deranged philosopher puts it, consequences. Consequences for constant demonization of opponents. Those consequences being brutally murdered by a leftist, as seen with Charlie Kirk. So, you know, politically motivated violence in order to make people afraid, in order to get them to do what you want. In other words, domestic terror.
Notifying somebody of a likely consequence that will occur given their actions is not tantamount to a threat. Now that I debunked your second video, I'm going to challenge you to a debate. Let's debate, Is the claim that Destiny made that we've been reviewing in these videos, is that claim incitement to violence? Let's have that debate. We could do a Zoom, whatever it is. I'm glad to have a civil conversation with you. I'll put aside the name calling. I'll put aside the condescension. We can have a man-to-man conversation. You represent your views. I'll represent mine. By the way, any excuse whatsoever to dodge this debate, I'm not entertaining that. That is sheer cowardice. You're a massive loser if you duck this debate. And by the way, I don't have a lot of faith in you. I think you're going to run. I think you know you're full of shit and you can't hold your own in a room with me. If you run, you imply to the audience that you cannot justify to a resisting opponent your views that Destiny's inciting violence. That is the ultimate form of cowardice, because you were very happy to sit there in front of 20,000 people and tell people without resistance Destiny's inciting violence. You were happy to do it again to 10,000 people when you addressed me. But can you do it with a live resisting opponent? We'll see if you have the courage of your convictions to do that.